The moment my own son looked away while his wife humiliated me, I realized I had already lost my family. My name is Margaret Collins, and at 67 years old, I never imagined that the people I loved most would become strangers sitting across the same dinner table. It happened on a warm Saturday evening in late May. The sun was beginning to set over the backyard of my son Daniel's beautiful suburban home outside Phoenix, Arizona. String lights hung above the patio. Children laughed near the swimming pool. Music drifted softly from outdoor speakers. Friends and relatives filled every corner of the yard. It was my grandson Ethan's 10th birthday party, and nearly everyone important to our family was there. For weeks, I had helped prepare for the celebration. I baked the cake from scratch using the same recipe my mother taught me over 40 years ago. I spent hours wrapping gifts. I even arrived early that morning to help decorate the backyard. Nobody asked me to do those things. I simply did them because that is what mothers and grandmothers do. We give without keeping score. We help because we love. As guests continued arriving, I carried a tray of drinks toward the patio tables when I noticed something unusual. Every seat at the main family table already had a name card. Daniel's name was there. Vanessa's name was there. My grandchildren's names were there. Even distant cousins had reserved seats. Mine was missing. At first, I assumed it was an oversight. I looked around for an empty place setting. There was none. My stomach tightened slightly, but I told myself not to overreact. Surely there was an explanation. Then Vanessa walked over. My daughter-in-law smiled politely, but there was no warmth behind it. "Margaret," she said, glancing toward the table. "We had to make a few adjustments because of space." I nodded slowly. I noticed. She pointed toward a small folding table near the edge of the yard. It sat beside the fence, several yards away from the family gathering. Two elderly neighbors were seated there along with a teenage babysitter. "We thought that spot would be more comfortable for you." For a moment, I simply stared at her. Comfortable. That was the word she chose. Not respectful. Not practical. Comfortable. The truth was obvious. I had been removed from my own family's table. I looked toward Daniel, hoping he would say something. Anything. He was standing only 20 feet away talking with guests. Our eyes met briefly. He knew exactly what was happening. I could see it in his face. Then he looked away. That hurt more than Vanessa's words ever could. Throughout dinner, I sat quietly at the small table while the rest of the family laughed together beneath the lights. No one invited me over. No one noticed when I stopped eating. No one seemed concerned that the woman who had spent decades caring for this family was sitting alone. Later in the evening, while gifts were being opened, Vanessa stood near the center of the gathering thanking everyone for their support. Then she said something that changed everything. "Families evolve," she announced with a smile. "Sometimes people need to accept when their role becomes less important." Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Others pretended not to understand who she was talking about. I did. So did Daniel. Once again, he said nothing. The silence around me felt louder than any insult. I quietly picked up my purse and walked toward the driveway. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed. As I reached my car, I looked back one final time at the family I had spent my entire life building. They were laughing beneath the lights as though nothing had happened, as though I no longer mattered. They did not know it yet, but that would be the last time they ever saw the old Margaret Collins. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, but unlike so many mornings before, I did not immediately reach for my phone to check whether Daniel had called. For years, my life had revolved around my family. Every holiday, every birthday, every school event, every emergency. If someone needed help, they called me. If someone needed money, they called me. If someone needed childcare, transportation, advice, or support, they called me. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether they valued me and simply assumed they did. Sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, I began looking through old photo albums stored in a cabinet near the dining room. There was Daniel at 6 years old holding his first baseball trophy. There he was again at 18, wearing his high school graduation gown. Then his wedding day. Then the birth of his children. Page after page showed moments I had helped make possible. Yet as I turned each photograph, I noticed something strange. I could remember every sacrifice behind those smiles. The second job I worked when Daniel needed tuition money. The weekends I spent caring for the children while Vanessa and Daniel traveled. The retirement savings I withdrew years earlier to help them make a down payment on their first house. They called it family support. I called it love. Looking back now, I realized nobody had ever asked what those sacrifices cost me. Around noon, my closest friend, Susan Parker, stopped by. Susan and I had known each other for more than 30 years. She took one look at my face and immediately knew something was wrong. After listening quietly to the entire story, she set down her coffee cup and shook her head. "Margaret, they have been taking you for granted for years." I wanted to argue with her. Instead, I found myself staring out the window. Deep down, I knew she was right. The birthday party had not created the problem. It had simply exposed it. Over the following days, I waited to hear from Daniel. Surely he would call. Surely he would apologize. Surely he would explain what happened. Monday passed. Then Tuesday. Then Wednesday. Nothing. No phone call. No text message. No visit. The silence hurt far more than I expected. By Friday evening, I finally received a message. My heart actually skipped when I saw his name appear on my phone. But when I opened it, the message contained only a single question. "Can you watch the kids next weekend?" There was no mention of the party. No apology. No concern about why I had left early. No acknowledgement of the humiliation. Just a request. For several minutes, I stared at the screen. Then I set the phone down without responding. It was the first time in years that I had not immediately said yes. During the following weeks, something inside me began changing. I started noticing how one-sided every relationship had become. Vanessa only called when she needed something. Daniel only reached out when there was a problem to solve. Even family gatherings seemed designed around what I could provide rather than who I was. The realization was painful, but it was also freeing. For the first time in decades, I began asking myself a question I had never seriously considered. What would my life look like if it belonged to me instead of everyone else? One evening, while sorting through old financial records, I came across information about a small property I had inherited years earlier outside Scottsdale, Arizona. I had almost forgotten about it. As I reviewed the documents, an idea slowly began taking shape. It was not revenge. It was not anger. It was something far more important. It was independence. And as I sat there holding those papers, I realized that perhaps losing my place at their table was not the end of my story. Perhaps it was the beginning of an entirely different one. Over the next month, I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped volunteering for a life where I was no longer appreciated. I did not announce it. I did not argue with anyone. I simply stopped making myself available every time my family expected me to solve a problem. The first test came sooner than expected. 2 weeks after Daniel sent that message asking me to babysit, he called again. This time, he sounded slightly frustrated. "Mom, Vanessa and I have a dinner event Saturday night. We need someone to watch the kids." Need. Not would you like to. Not how have you been. Just need. For years, I would have rearranged my entire schedule without hesitation. Instead, I looked out the window at the desert sunset glowing across the Arizona sky and calmly said, "I am sorry, Daniel. I have other plans." Silence filled the line. "Other plans?" he repeated. "Yes." Another pause followed. "Okay," he finally replied, sounding more confused than disappointed. After we hung up, I realized something important. My family had become so accustomed to my sacrifices that they viewed them as permanent fixtures in their lives. Like electricity or running water. They noticed only when those things disappeared. A few days later, Vanessa called. Her tone was sweet at first. She asked how I was doing and made polite conversation for nearly 3 minutes. Then she arrived at the real reason for the call. "We were hoping you could help with the kids during summer break." I almost smiled. "I will not be available." Her friendliness faded immediately. "You seem different lately." "Maybe I am." The conversation ended shortly afterward. For the first time, I felt no guilt. Meanwhile, I continued researching the property outside Scottsdale. It was a modest piece of land located near a growing retirement community. Years earlier, I had inherited it from my older brother. At the time, I viewed it as little more than paperwork. Now, after meeting with a local real estate advisor, I discovered something unexpected. The property had increased significantly in value. Even more surprising, several developers had recently expressed interest in nearby land. What I once considered an afterthought was becoming an opportunity. Susan accompanied me to several meetings. One afternoon, after reviewing potential options, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. "You know what is funny?" she said. "For years, you spent all your energy helping everyone else build their future. And now?" I asked. "Now you finally get to build your own." Her words stayed with me. Because for the first time in decades, I was making decisions based on what I wanted instead of what others expected. Back in Phoenix, Daniel and Vanessa appeared to be thriving, at least from the outside. Social media showed family vacations, restaurant dinners, and smiling photographs. Friends constantly commented about how perfect their lives seemed. But appearances can be misleading. One evening, my granddaughter Emma called unexpectedly. At 14, she was old enough to notice things adults often tried to hide. "Grandma," she asked quietly, "why do you never come over anymore?" The question caught me off guard. "I suppose everyone has been busy. Mom and Dad argue a lot now," she admitted. "Ever since you stopped helping." I did not know how to respond. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. It was not satisfaction I felt. It was sadness. Because despite everything that had happened, I never wanted my family to struggle. Yet for years, I had been holding pieces together without realizing it. Now those pieces were beginning to shift. As summer moved forward, the distance between us continued growing. They assumed I would eventually return to my old role. They assumed I would keep giving because that was what I had always done. What none of them understood was that I had already started building a life beyond the boundaries of their expectations. And for the first time in many years, that life belonged entirely to me. By early autumn, the changes in my life had become impossible to ignore. What started as a simple decision to reclaim my independence was slowly transforming into something much larger. After months of meetings, paperwork, and careful planning, I finalized an agreement involving the Scottsdale property. The outcome exceeded every expectation I had when I first opened those dusty folders at my kitchen table. For the first time in many years, I felt financially secure without depending on anyone and without anyone depending on me. The feeling was unfamiliar but comforting. Each morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with solving someone else's problems. I joined community groups, attended local events, and made friends who knew me simply as Margaret, not as someone's mother, mother-in-law, or grandmother. They asked about my interests rather than my availability. They listened when I spoke. They valued my opinions. It was remarkable how different life felt when appreciation replaced expectation. Meanwhile, news from Daniel's household reached me through occasional conversations with Emma. I never asked her for details, but teenagers often shared more than adults intended. According to her, tensions inside the house continued growing. Small disagreements turned into larger arguments. Responsibilities that I had quietly handled for years were now sources of frustration. Childcare schedules became complicated. Unexpected expenses appeared. Even simple family gatherings required far more effort than before. One afternoon, Emma called while walking home from school. "Grandma, I miss your Sunday dinners," she said. Her words brought a smile to my face. For years, every Sunday evening my dining room had been filled with laughter, homemade food, and family conversations. I had stopped hosting after the birthday incident. Nobody ever asked why. They simply assumed the tradition had ended. "I miss them too," I admitted. "Maybe we can have one someday." "I would like that," she replied quietly. After the call ended, I sat on my patio watching the Arizona sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and gold. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to keep everyone happy. The truth was painful but clear. I had confused being needed with being loved. They were not always the same thing. Several weeks later, I received an unexpected invitation. A distant cousin was hosting a family reunion outside Phoenix. Nearly everyone would be attending, including Daniel and Vanessa. At first, I considered declining. Then I realized something important. I was no longer avoiding them. I simply no longer organized my life around them. Whether I attended or not should depend on what I wanted. In the end, I accepted. The reunion was scheduled for late October. As the date approached, I noticed something unusual. Daniel began contacting me more frequently. The conversations were polite but awkward. He asked how I was doing. He asked about my health. He even asked whether I needed anything. The sudden interest felt strange after months of silence. During one call, he hesitated before speaking. "Mom, everyone is looking forward to seeing you at the reunion." Everyone. The word lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. Something about his tone suggested there was more he wanted to say, more he was afraid to say. A few days later, Susan stopped by for lunch. After listening to the latest developments, she laughed softly. "Sounds like they are starting to realize what life looks like without you." I shook my head. "Maybe." "No," she replied confidently. Definitely. As the reunion drew closer, I had no idea that the cracks forming inside Daniel and Vanessa's carefully constructed world were about to become impossible to hide. For months, they had been struggling behind closed doors while pretending everything was fine. Soon, those struggles would begin surfacing in ways none of them could control. And for the first time, they would be forced to face a reality they had spent years ignoring. The family reunion took place on a bright Saturday afternoon at a large community park on the outskirts of Phoenix. Rows of picnic tables stretched beneath shaded ramadas, while children ran across open fields and relatives gathered in small groups, sharing stories and catching up on each other's lives. When I arrived, several heads turned almost immediately. At first, I assumed they were simply surprised to see me after months of keeping to myself. Then I realized something else. For the first time in years, I looked different. Not because of expensive clothes or dramatic changes. I simply looked happy. The constant exhaustion that had followed me for so long was gone. The worry lines on my face seemed softer. I carried myself differently. Confidence has a way of changing how people see you. As I walked toward the gathering area, cousins and old friends greeted me warmly. Several commented on how well I looked. Others asked about my new projects and activities. The conversations felt genuine. Nobody was asking for favors. Nobody needed me to solve a problem. They simply wanted to talk. Across the lawn, I spotted Daniel and Vanessa. Even from a distance, something seemed off. Their smiles appeared forced. Their body language lacked the easy confidence they once displayed. During previous family events, Vanessa often positioned herself at the center of every conversation. Today she seemed distracted, checking her phone repeatedly while forcing polite laughter. Daniel looked tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. As the afternoon continued, small details began revealing a larger story. A relative quietly mentioned that Daniel's business had been struggling. Another cousin commented that the family had recently canceled a planned vacation. Someone else mentioned hearing about unexpected financial pressures. Individually, none of the comments seemed significant. Together, they painted a picture very different from the perfect life displayed online. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing near a refreshment table when Emma approached. She wrapped her arms around me and hugged me tightly. "I am so glad you came," she said. There was a sincerity in her voice that nearly broke my heart. "I am glad to see you too," I replied. We spent nearly an hour talking. She told me about school, her friends, and her plans for the future. Then her expression grew more serious. "Things have been hard at home lately." I listened quietly. "Mom and Dad argue about money all the time now. Dad works longer hours. Mom is stressed. Nobody seems happy anymore." Her words saddened me more than they surprised me. Families often fail to recognize the invisible support systems holding everything together until those systems disappear. For years, I had absorbed pressure before it reached everyone else. Without realizing it, they had built their lives around that stability. As the sun began setting, a conversation near one of the picnic tables suddenly drew attention. Vanessa was speaking with several relatives. Her voice sounded strained. "People keep exaggerating our situation," she insisted. "Everything is under control." The problem was that nobody seemed convinced. Even Daniel remained silent beside her. Then something unexpected happened. An older uncle casually mentioned how impressive it was that I had managed my recent property venture so successfully. Several people immediately became interested. Questions followed. What had I done? How had it worked out? What were my future plans? I answered politely, never boasting or seeking attention. Yet with every response, I noticed Vanessa becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The attention she once enjoyed had quietly shifted elsewhere. For years, she had viewed me as someone whose value came only from what I could provide. Now people were beginning to see me differently. As evening settled over the park, Daniel finally approached me alone. His expression was hesitant, almost nervous. "Mom," he said quietly, "there are some things we need to talk about." I looked into his eyes and immediately understood. Whatever problems had been growing inside his carefully constructed world were no longer small enough to ignore. And for the first time since that birthday party, he was finally ready to admit it. After the reunion ended, Daniel asked if we could meet the following week. His voice carried a humility I had not heard in a very long time. We agreed to have lunch at a small restaurant halfway between our homes. On the day of the meeting, I arrived a few minutes early and chose a quiet table near the window. When Daniel walked in, I immediately noticed how different he looked. The confident man who once seemed certain about every decision now appeared weighed down by responsibilities he could no longer manage. He sat across from me and spent several moments staring at the menu without reading it. Finally, he set it aside and looked directly at me. "Mom," he said softly, "I owe you an apology." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I had imagined hearing those words many times over the past months, yet now that they had finally arrived, they felt different than I expected. There was no satisfaction, only sadness for everything that had happened. Daniel explained that after I stepped back from the family, problems they never anticipated began surfacing. Childcare expenses increased dramatically. Household responsibilities became overwhelming. Financial pressures mounted as costs rose faster than expected. Small disagreements became larger conflicts. "I never realized how much you were doing," he admitted. I listened quietly. "That was part of the problem," I replied. "Nobody realized." He nodded slowly. Then he told me something that surprised me. Vanessa had not been handling the family's finances as carefully as everyone believed. Several unnecessary purchases and poorly planned expenses had created additional strain. Nothing dishonest, nothing dramatic, just a long series of decisions made without considering long-term consequences. When combined with Daniel's business challenges, the situation became increasingly difficult. "We kept thinking things would improve on their own," he said. "Instead, they kept getting worse." His words reminded me of something I had learned years earlier. Problems ignored do not disappear. They simply become more expensive. As lunch continued, Daniel asked questions about my life. Real questions, not requests disguised as conversations. He wanted to know about my projects, my new friends, and the plans I was making for the future. For the first time in years, I felt like he was speaking to me as a person rather than a resource. Before we left, he hesitated again. "Mom, there is something else." I waited. "Would you consider coming by the house sometime?" The request hung between us. Months earlier, I would have accepted immediately. Now I considered it carefully. "Perhaps," I said, "but things cannot go back to the way they were." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I know." During the weeks that followed, more truths slowly emerged. Several relatives contacted me privately after hearing about the reunion. Some apologized for remaining silent during the birthday incident. Others admitted they had noticed Vanessa's behavior for years, but never spoke up because they wanted to avoid conflict. Their honesty was appreciated, but it also confirmed something painful. Many people had seen what was happening. Few had been willing to acknowledge it. Meanwhile, my own life continued improving. The property investment opened additional opportunities. I began working with local community organizations and mentoring women facing major life transitions after retirement. The work brought me a sense of fulfillment I had not experienced in years. One evening, while reviewing paperwork at my kitchen table, I received a call from Emma. Her voice sounded hopeful. "Grandma, Dad seems happier after talking with you." I smiled. "I am glad." Then she said something that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. "I think everyone is finally starting to understand how much you mattered. For years, I had wanted recognition. I had wanted appreciation. Now that those things were finally beginning to appear, I realized something unexpected. They were no longer the most important things. Because somewhere along the way, I had discovered something far more valuable. I had learned my worth did not depend on whether other people recognized it. And that realization changed everything. 2 weeks after my lunch with Daniel, I received a phone call that I knew had been coming. It arrived on a quiet Tuesday evening while I was watering plants on my patio. The Arizona air was cool, and the sun had nearly disappeared behind the mountains. When I saw Daniel's name on the screen, I set down the watering can and answered. His voice sounded heavier than usual. "Mom, can we talk?" There was something different about the way he asked. The confidence that once defined him had been replaced by humility. We spoke for nearly an hour. For the first time, he stopped minimizing the problems facing his family. His business was struggling more than he had admitted. Several clients had delayed contracts. Expenses continued rising. The pressure at home was affecting everyone. Even the children had begun noticing the tension. "I do not know how everything got this complicated," he confessed. I listened quietly before answering. "Most problems do not appear overnight, Daniel. They grow slowly while people convince themselves everything is fine." The silence that followed told me he understood exactly what I meant. Then came the question I think he had been building toward the entire conversation. "Mom, would you come over this weekend?" I looked out across the darkening sky. Months earlier, hearing those words would have felt like a victory. Instead, I felt surprisingly calm. "Why?" I asked gently. He hesitated. "Because I think we need you." The honesty in his answer caught me off guard. There were no excuses, no attempts to manipulate the situation, just the truth. After we ended the call, I sat outside for a long time thinking about everything that had happened. Part of me remembered the humiliation at the birthday party. Part of me remembered the months of silence that followed. But another part remembered Daniel as a little boy sitting at my kitchen table doing homework while I cooked dinner. Life is rarely as simple as heroes and villains. Families are complicated because love and disappointment often exist side by side. That weekend, I drove to their house for the first time in nearly 6 months. As I turned onto their street, memories came rushing back. I had spent countless afternoons there helping with homework, preparing meals, and celebrating holidays. Yet when I pulled into the driveway, it felt unfamiliar. The front yard looked less maintained than I remembered. Several packages sat near the door. Small details suggested a household struggling to keep up with daily demands. Daniel opened the door before I could knock. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. Then he stepped aside and quietly said, "Welcome home, Mom." Inside, the atmosphere felt different. The children greeted me with genuine excitement. Emma hugged me tightly. Ethan practically ran across the room. Their happiness alone made the visit worthwhile. Vanessa appeared moments later. For the first time since I had known her, she looked uncertain. Gone was the confidence that once filled every room she entered. She stood quietly for several seconds before speaking. "Thank you for coming." It was not an apology. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Throughout the afternoon, I observed more than I spoke. The family was exhausted. Responsibilities had piled up. Communication had broken down. Nobody seemed to know how to fix it. Yet what struck me most was not the financial strain or household stress. It was the absence of connection. Somewhere along the way, they had become so focused on managing problems that they forgot how to support one another. As evening approached, we gathered around the dining table. Ironically, it was the same table where I once felt invisible. This time, Daniel pulled out a chair beside him and said, "Mom, sit here." The gesture was simple, but its meaning was impossible to miss. And as I looked around the room, I realized my return was not about rescuing anyone. It was about allowing them to finally see what they had spent years taking for granted. Over the next several weeks, I visited Daniel's home occasionally, but I did so on my own terms. I was no longer there to carry the weight of everyone else's responsibilities. Instead, I came as a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who finally understood the value of healthy boundaries. At first, the adjustment was difficult for everyone. Daniel would sometimes start asking me to solve problems the way I always had. Then he would stop himself and figure them out on his own. The children adapted quickly. In many ways, they seemed relieved simply to have peace returning to the household. The biggest change, however, came from the person I least expected. Vanessa. One afternoon, she asked if we could talk privately. We sat on the back patio while the children were at school and Daniel was at work. The Arizona sun was bright, but a cool breeze moved through the yard. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Vanessa surprised me. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. Unlike previous conversations, there was no defensiveness in her voice, no attempt to justify her behavior. She looked tired, not physically exhausted, but emotionally worn down. "For a long time," she continued, "I convinced myself that everything this family had was because of what Daniel and I built together." She paused and looked down at her hands. "I never stopped to think about everything you had already given before I arrived." I listened without interrupting. "The birthday party was wrong," she admitted. "The things I said were wrong. And what hurts most is that I knew it even then." Her honesty caught me off guard. For months, I had imagined this conversation happening in a dozen different ways. None of them looked like this. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, just the uncomfortable truth finally being spoken aloud. "Why now?" I asked gently. Vanessa looked toward the house. "Because when you left, I thought life would stay the same." A sad smile crossed her face. Instead, everything fell apart. I understood what she meant. This was never about punishment. Nobody had suffered because I wanted revenge. They had suffered because they finally experienced the responsibilities I had quietly carried for years. "I am not asking you to fix anything," Vanessa said. I just wanted you to know that I understand now." For the first time since the birthday party, I saw genuine humility in her eyes. And, strangely enough, I felt no anger. Carrying resentment had become unnecessary. Life had already taught the lesson far better than I ever could. A few days later, Daniel invited several family members to dinner. The atmosphere felt completely different from gatherings in the past. People spoke more honestly. They listened more carefully. Even the children seemed happier. During the meal, Emma shared news about a school achievement. Ethan talked excitedly about a science project. Laughter returned to the table, but this time it felt real rather than performative. Then Daniel stood up and cleared his throat. The room grew quiet. "There is something I want to say," he began. He looked directly at me. For years, I assumed Mom would always be there. I never stopped to appreciate everything she sacrificed for this family. His voice grew softer. And when she needed respect, I failed her. The room remained silent. Nobody looked away. "I cannot change what happened," he continued, "but I can acknowledge it." Then he raised his glass. "To Mom." One by one, everyone followed. Even Vanessa. As I looked around the table, I realized something remarkable. The people who once overlooked my value were finally seeing it clearly. Not because I demanded recognition, not because I fought for attention, but because my absence forced them to confront the truth. And now that truth had changed every relationship in the room. Nearly a year had passed since the evening I walked away from that birthday party, feeling invisible. Looking back, it felt like a lifetime ago. The woman who left that gathering with tears in her eyes was not the same woman sitting on her patio on a warm spring morning watching the Arizona sunrise. Life had changed in ways I never could have predicted. Some changes were financial, some were personal, but the most important changes happened inside me. I no longer measured my worth by how useful I was to other people. I no longer believed love required endless sacrifice without respect. Most importantly, I no longer feared being alone. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel invited the entire family to a small celebration at his house. This time, there was no special occasion, no birthday, no holiday. He simply wanted everyone together. As I walked into the backyard, I immediately noticed something familiar. The same patio lights hung overhead. The same tables filled the yard. The same family members gathered beneath the warm Arizona sky. Yet everything felt different. Several relatives greeted me warmly the moment I arrived. Others pulled me aside to share updates about their lives. Even family members who had remained silent during difficult times now seemed eager to reconnect. The greatest difference, however, was where they wanted me to sit. A place had been reserved at the center of the main table. Not because I demanded it, not because anyone felt obligated, but because everyone understood I belonged there. As dinner began, laughter flowed easily through the gathering. The tension that once divided the family had faded. Daniel seemed more confident than he had in months. Vanessa looked calmer as well. Their financial situation was steadily improving. More importantly, they had learned to work together instead of against each other. The children seemed happier than ever. Emma was preparing for college applications. Ethan enthusiastically shared plans for a school competition. Watching them, I realized how much I had missed simply being a grandmother rather than everyone's emergency solution. Later that evening, as the sun began setting, Vanessa approached carrying a small envelope. She handed it to me with a nervous smile. "I found this while cleaning," she said. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a photograph taken nearly 15 years earlier. The picture showed a younger version of me sitting at a crowded family dinner while holding a toddler Emma in my lap. Everyone in the photograph was smiling. On the back, someone had written a simple sentence: "The heart of this family." For a moment, emotion caught in my throat. Vanessa looked down before speaking. "You were always holding us together. We just did not appreciate it." There it was. Not a dramatic apology. Not a grand gesture. Just the truth. And sometimes the truth is the most powerful thing a person can offer. As darkness settled over the backyard, family members gathered for a group photo. This time, nobody stood off to the side. Nobody sat at a separate table. Nobody was treated as less important. When the photographer asked everyone to move closer together, Emma grabbed my hand and pulled me directly into the center of the group. The camera flashed. Laughter followed. And in that moment, I finally understood what it meant for people to pay the price for their mistakes. It was not about revenge. It was not about humiliation. The real price was regret. The realization that they had nearly lost someone who loved them unconditionally. The realization that respect should have been given long before it was earned back. As I drove home later that night beneath a sky full of stars, I felt a sense of peace that had taken years to find. My family had changed. I had changed. Some wounds would always leave scars, but scars are proof that healing happened. And if there was one lesson I hoped they would never forget, it was this. The people who quietly carry a family are often the ones whose value is recognized only after they walk away. Fortunately for us, we were given a second chance before it was too late.